After months of anticipation spawned from an impressively meaty gameplay demo, Lies of P was released by NeoWiz Games and Round 8 Studio on September 19th to a somewhat mixed reception. Up to this point, no studio has managed to capture the hearts of critics and the public with their Souls-like games, quite like From Software, who spawned the genre with the innovative action RPG Demon's Souls, and this Pinocchio-inspired romp is no exception. Despite this, I think that Lies of P is the most complete and cohesive entry to the Souls-like genre to come from the minds of a different studio. I'm happy that I can say that, because it explores themes that the team at From Software are clearly never going to, as their own dark fantasy narratives become increasingly and ironically stagnant. It carefully combines ideas from Software's modern lineup, namely Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, and Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, and blends those influences with some much-needed quality of life and user interface improvements to create a highly customizable adventure that's dripping in the gorgeous visuals and tight combat encounters that we've come to expect from the genre. It's an impressive love letter to all of its inspirations that still has its own unique vision, and it clearly came from a team that wants to see the genre grow, even if the broader gaming community does not. As a result, it's a perfect case study to show us just how much Souls-likes have evolved and changed since the low-key release of Demon's Souls way back in 2009. Souls-likes champion player freedom and give players a wide variety of options for dealing with any given situation or combat encounter, and they are very much focused on combat, even as early as Demon's Souls. Players spend a lot of time upgrading their equipment, purchasing items, and leveling their character to prepare for upcoming combat challenges. In that sense, the role-playing primarily revolves around action, and your in-character choices will determine the means through which you engage with your opponents. In the last video, we discussed how Demon's Souls used its currency, called Souls, and its failure states to encourage players to experiment with the multiplayer, the world tendency mechanic, and the other consequence-driven risk-reward systems that define the game. This type of universal currency, which now goes by many names, persists across almost every game I'm going to mention in this video and serves the same purposes that it did in the original Demon's Souls everywhere else. Instead of discussing that, we're going to focus on the fundamentals of combat, the varying degrees of freedom that players are given to craft builds, and the ways that game mechanics are used for storytelling throughout the genre. The starting classes in Demon's Souls and its successors act as a starting point for your stats and gear, but they don't bind you to any specific categories of equipment or magic casting styles. Most Souls-likes don't even have classes in the traditional tabletop RPG sense, instead choosing to fully embrace more freeform character progression systems. Because of this freedom, you'll have access to a wide range of offensive and defensive tools regardless of your class. Later entries to the genre will even let you reroll your stats multiple times, making it easy to experiment with different tactics or fine-tune your existing build. The flow of combat will be dictated by how you choose to invest your limited resources and by the weapons, spells, and armors you want to use. No character will have access to everything, but the amount of choices can still be dizzying. You can carry up to 2 pieces of gear per hand for most of the series and switch between them on the fly. Casting spells requires you to commit one of your hands to a casting item, such as a magic wand or holy talisman, and melee weapons will have 2 sets of animations based on how you're holding them. One-handing weapons will leave your left hand available for another tool, while using both hands on a weapon will change the way your character wields it and increase your strength stat. This provides an incentive for players who level strength to use both hands on their weapons, which comes at the cost of defensive options. While you can block with 2-handed weapons, they'll never be as good at the task as a shield would be. Melee weapons have 2 types of attacks, light attacks and heavy attacks that cost different amounts of stamina and require varying levels of commitment from the player. Heavy attacks require a longer wind-up and recovery animation, opening you up to attacks from enemies, but will deal more damage and in some cases deal a different type of damage than a light attack would have with the same weapon. For instance, short swords deal piercing damage instead of standard damage when you use a heavy attack. These are only 2 of the several types of damage that weapons can deal, the others being slashing damage and blunt damage. Weapons can also be enchanted or coated with consumable items to deal magical or elemental damage in addition to their normal damage type. Lies of P provides a reusable source of elemental damage with its grindstone, which allows you to freely experiment with damage types without worrying about wasting limited resources. Most enemies are more susceptible to specific types of attacks. Fleshy creatures will bleed from slashing weapons like scimitars, and fire will be more effective against them. Heavily armored enemies like knights will shrug off most damage types unless you can pierce their armor with a piercing weapon. Other creatures like undead skeletons and stone gargoyles are completely immune to bleed and most other status effects, but shatter when struck by a blunt weapon. This is a surprisingly consistent element of the genre, and you can usually tell what type of damage an enemy is susceptible to just by looking at them. This means that players can actually plan ahead and think about how they want to tackle an upcoming area before they've committed to exploring it. Different games might use different terms from the ones in Demon's Souls, but the core idea is the same. Enemies can be damaged by everything, but observation can be the key to giving yourself an easier time with a level and acts as an incentive to experiment with different weapons. This also means that different builds will struggle more or less in different areas of the game. A dexterity character who uses curved swords might have an easy time with the fleshy enemies in the Tower of Latria, but a harder time with the skeletons in the Shrine of Storms. This helps the world feel more textured, and is no doubt a big part of why people pay so much attention to the environmental details of these games. It's clear that player agency is a top priority when designing the Souls games. The game designers want you to come up with your own unique solutions to the obstacles that are put in front of you, so while everyone will encounter the same trials and tribulations throughout the world, everyone will end up approaching them differently, and this can result in emergent gameplay scenarios and organic stories about your experience that can be shared with other players. This is a huge step up from the traditional dungeon crawlers that inspired Demon's Souls, such as Kingsfield and Diablo, which I mentioned in the previous video. For reference, Diablo allows you to wield one-handed or two-handed weapons as well, but weapons are segregated by type and only fall into one group or the other. Players have three major defensive tools that they can use to deal with enemy attacks, and most Souls-like games focus on testing players on only one or two of them. Dodge rolling, the most persistent option, grants you a small window of invincibility while moving you quickly in the direction of your choosing. Blocking consumes stamina and may still result in chip damage. Parrying will deflect an attack entirely and open up the enemy to a devastating counterattack, and finally, players can simply walk or sprint out of the way to avoid damage. Piercing weapons like spears can attack while you're blocking, giving them some additional defensive utility. Unfortunately, these weapons are also easier for enemies and other players to parry. Take note of the fact that all of your combat abilities have distinct pros and cons depending on the enemy you're fighting and the kinds of attacks that you'll be trying to avoid. This doesn't mean that they're all perfectly balanced, but it does mean that you'll have distinct strengths and weaknesses designed into your build. Most bosses in Demon's Souls and Dark Souls cannot be parried, meaning that your options are typically reduced to blocking or dodge rolling to avoid damage. Blocking a powerful attack may stagger you and drain you of all your stamina, preventing you from retaliating and forcing you to play defensively while your stamina regenerates. Larger shields and heavier armor will absorb more damage, but will also weigh more and potentially push you into relying on them almost exclusively by reducing the effectiveness of your dodge roll and reducing your stamina regeneration. In most situations, players will be mixing responses to attacks based on their confidence. In my case, I prefer to use shields as a last resort to block damage when I'm not able to dodge it. When possible, I try to roll towards enemies while avoiding their attacks so that I'm in an optimal position to throw out a counterattack or two while they recover. The lengthy animations in these games determine the pace of the combat, and both players and NPCs must commit to their actions, resulting in a methodical and thoughtful experience where individual mistakes can be massively punished while still giving players room for tons of skill expression. Because every attack and damage animation will usually play out in full, there's a satisfying and easily comprehensible rhythm to things as you weave dodge rolls, attacks, and spells together while carefully spacing them out in order to preserve your stamina. The wide variety in animations makes the weapon classes feel distinct and gives the developers more ways to make each game feel unique when compared to the others in the genre. In many ways, the stamina system is the glue that holds the combat together. Stamina meters are common in action games, but Demon's Souls and its successors have implemented the idea in a way that's easy to intuit while still adding a great deal of depth to the game. Instead of making stamina a long-term resource that has to be managed throughout an entire fight, as is the case in Skyrim or Shadow of the Colossus, it's a short-term resource that regenerates very quickly. Every action except for walking and spellcasting consumes some amount of stamina, and many actions actually end up consuming a substantial amount of it. Heavy attacks with large weapons might end up eating through nearly all of it in one or two swings, while smaller weapons will support longer combos. Dodge rolls and sprinting consume a moderate amount of stamina, and both will reduce your bandwidth to attack and respond to incoming damage for a short period of time. Parrying, the highest risk defensive option that you have, actually gives you an opportunity to regenerate stamina while dealing damage during the counterattack if you succeed. The stamina system breaks combat into a series of micro-decisions and puts a larger focus on moment-to-moment gameplay than it does on long, protracted fights. It reminds me of the real-time turn-based combat system of Final Fantasy IV, where each unit has to wait for an action bar to fill up before they can make a move, but applied to a truly real-time game environment. Most games that we call Soulslikes either recreate this stamina system or don't have one at all. The further you move away from Demon Souls on its family tree, the more action-oriented the games become. Dark Souls inherited the combat system from Demon Souls and only made a few small tweaks and polished up the animations. Weapons now have a lunging attack that you can execute by pushing the analog stick forward and heavy attacking at the same time. These function as an even higher commitment heavy attack. Dark Souls also added a system called Poise, which was designed to make heavy armor more viable through an invisible poise meter that, when depleted, causes you to stagger. The higher the poise value of your armor, the harder it'll be for enemies to interrupt your attack animations or stun lock you during a combo. This actually ended up being a little too strong, since now large weapons and their prolonged, high-commitment animations have almost no meaningful downside, but it certainly helps you feel the weight of your armor both while rolling and while getting struck with attacks. Demon Souls didn't have this, and instead had a system that's commonly referred to as hyper armor, which was only applied to certain animations. Most attacks could be interrupted by taking damage, cancelling them, but those with hyper armor will play out even if you get hit in the middle of your windup. The attack animations with hyper armor are set in stone, and armor has no effect on them. This is the same system that Lies of P uses, and while some dislike it, I think it's easy to understand and reduces the number of exploitable mechanics in the game. Dark Souls also introduces drop attacks, which aren't terribly useful because there's no jump button, but they do give players something to do while they're falling off of objects in the environment. The first two bosses, Asylum Demon and Taurus Demon, prominently feature drop attack opportunities in order to teach you about the mechanic. This is carried through to the rest of the games, although it does play a pretty minor role because of how rare it is for you to literally get the drop on enemies, but it's a good addition because it does give you something to do in the rare instances where that does occur. There's one more offensive option I've left out up to this point, and it's the only part of the combat system that I think was implemented poorly: backstabs. Enemies are incredibly susceptible to the time-honored gaming tradition of circle strafing. It completely shatters the balance of the combat system once you realize how easy it is to get around to the back of supposedly formidable foes like the Black Knights in Dark Souls. Demon Souls even teaches the player how important it is to get behind enemies by putting you up against these shielded blobs called hoplites in the very first level as part of the first boss fight. It's very easy to strafe around to an enemy's back and stab them unless you're fighting in a tight corridor or there are multiple enemies running towards you at the same time, which is sometimes the case, but Dark Souls has a habit of confronting you with Black Knights in one-on-one scenarios, and you're given plenty of space to lead knights to an open area where you can easily put them down with a few well-placed backstabs. There isn't even a lot of risk associated with doing this, assuming you're equipped with a shield, and enemies don't have an answer for it. Backstabs and critical hits in general also have questionable hit detection, especially in PvP, where your internet connection can result in what are lovingly called lag stabs, and they don't always work on slopes or stairs, leaving me feeling dissatisfied with this mechanic overall, even if I'll happily abuse it. Luckily, the next game in line here does quite a bit to fix this issue and makes a few careful tweaks to the combat system that we've just established. While Dark Souls elected to refine the core mechanics of Demon Souls and focused on creating a more dense world with its interconnected levels, Bloodborne obliterates mechanics entirely when they don't serve its narrative and themes. The game doesn't just give you a backstab because you got behind an enemy, you need to open them up to a critical strike by attacking their back with a charged heavy attack first, which is a new mechanic in and of itself. This does fix part of my problem with backstabs, although they still don't work on slopes. The charged heavy attack is one of the many new additions to the player's moveset, and they're integrated into the existing control scheme quite well. There are now dedicated attack animations for when you perform a light attack input in the middle of a roll or while sprinting, and future games in the genre would include many of these organic animations while adding a few additional ones of their own. Lies of P does even more to remedy my problems with critical strikes and backstabs, referred to as fatal attacks here. When you do manage to stagger an enemy or get behind them, there's a visual indicator that your next attack is going to result in a fatal attack. Bosses will even show you a convenient circle that tells you exactly where you need to stand in order to successfully land the attack, which ensures that players will never be cheated out of their hard-earned reward for staggering an opponent. Fatal attacks also work well on slopes here, which is something that From Software still struggles with even in their most recent game, Elden Ring. Backstabs are still too easy to accomplish on a lot of enemies, but there's been a surprising amount of thought put into balancing them out, and enemies generally have good enough tracking that getting behind them will take a little bit of effort on your part. It isn't perfect, but it does exceed the standards set by other games in the genre, so I'll take it. Bloodborne and Lies of P both expand on the dodge roll from Demon Souls by implementing a new movement ability that exists alongside it, Quick Steps. When locked on to an enemy, your dodge roll inputs will automatically become Quick Steps instead, which provide a burst of movement and some invincibility frames like a dodge roll, but with a shorter and therefore lower commitment animation. This means that players are faster than they were in the previous games, and in Bloodborne the equipment load system that reduced the mobility of players wearing heavier armor or carrying large weapons has been removed alongside all forms of heavy armor. This makes it easier to get behind enemies than it was in the previous games, which is probably why backstabs are locked behind charged heavy attacks. Lies of P still has an equipment load system with weight breakpoints, but even heavier players will have better dodges than a heavy character in Dark Souls or Demon Souls would. The armor in Bloodborne mostly consists of cloaks, shawls, trench coats, robes, and period-appropriate formal uniforms instead of medieval armor. The one heavier-looking metal helmet, the Iron Yar Ghoul helmet, even remarks on how unusual it is. This headwear is made of metal, a rarity for hunter garb, and has a high defense, but only against physical attacks. The wooden shield's description, an early defensive tool that most players probably won't use since it can't parry enemies, makes it clear why. Hunters do not usually employ shields, ineffectual against the strength of the beasts as they tend to be. The hunters in Yharnam clearly value being quick on their feet. The removal of heavier armor also came with the removal of Dark Souls 1's poise system and a return to the hyper armor from Demon Souls, which again only applies to specific attacks from certain weapons. The focus is clear. Bloodborne doesn't want you to block damage or wear heavy armor to absorb strikes. It doesn't want you getting hit in the first place. You're supposed to be weaving around attacks, circling around enemies, avoiding their forward lunges, and countering with the fluid attacks that you can perform during your dodges. A lot of players view armor in the later FromSoft Souls-likes as cosmetic items, since defensive stats and resistances are nowhere near as important as your ability to dodge attacks. Not only does Lies of P continue this trend, it goes a step further. Clothing is entirely cosmetic and provides no stat buffs at all. Instead, your defensive stats come from internal puppet parts. Better defensive options weigh more, and there are still safeguards in place to make it harder for players to have extremely high defense and high mobility, but not at the cost of character customization. I actually like this a lot, and hope that FromSoftware ends up adopting something similar in the future, since we've seen the genre move away from the practical and realistically weighted depiction of armor from Demon Souls in exchange for an action-oriented approach to player armor and builds. The only major complication that I can think of to this approach comes from player versus player combat, where everyone's capabilities need to be visually communicated by the way their character looks for balance purposes. Heavier armor is visually distinct from light armor or mage robes, whereas the internal puppet parts in Lies of P are not. Perhaps one solution to this would be to exaggerate the unique movement animations that each weight class uses, which are already present in subtle ways throughout the Souls games. Lies of P doesn't have a multiplayer component, so this isn't something that the game designers or artists needed to concern themselves with. Because armor and blocking have taken a back seat in Bloodborne, there's another new mechanic to act as a buffer between you and death, the rally system. Every time you take damage, you're given a few seconds to strike an enemy in order to regain some of your lost health. This is designed to encourage aggression and keep players close to their enemies as often as possible. In the games that came before Bloodborne, losing health often forced you to disengage from your opponents because it took a second or two to heal, and you were completely defenseless during the process, but here you're expected to double down and deal as much damage as possible instead. Critical strikes from parries will restore all of the health in your rally potential, which places a greater emphasis on finding openings to stagger enemies. The game designers want you to fight like a feral animal, to rip and tear into your prey instead of cautiously approaching it. There are still some elements that encourage careful exploration, but in general, reckless behavior isn't punished nearly as much here as it was in the previous games. The rally system is fairly forgiving and allows you to regain a lot of health, and you can even heal off of enemies during their death animations. I'm not sure how intentional that was, but it does help you stay alive. Consuming healing items also takes less time here, and you can move while doing it, making it easier to heal when you're close to an enemy even if you miss your rally window. Lies of P has its own version of the rally mechanic, but it functions a bit differently. Getting hit by an attack directly doesn't leave any health for you to regenerate, and will actually delete any of the potential health you had left to be recovered. Instead, only chip damage you receive while blocking can be regained. This is a good middle ground between the absolute damage of Dark Souls and the highly forgiving nature of Bloodborne, but it serves similar design goals. Serious slip-ups will almost always force you into using a healing item, but minor mistakes are easy to recover from even if you make a lot of them in a short period of time. The game designers have taken advantage of this by crafting more intricate and reflex-intensive movesets for your opponents, which might have felt unfair in an environment with more strict healing. Your reliance on the rally mechanic is going to depend on your build, because your rally potential and regeneration speed change based on the weapon you're using. While Lies of P has elements from all the games we've touched on so far, the game that's the most relevant and influential to it isn't Bloodborne or Dark Souls, it's my least favorite of the bunch, Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. This game is the point where the schism between the parts of the gaming community that see these games as RPGs and the parts that see them as pure action games really solidified. There are no RPG systems like levels, a character creator, or even multiple primary weapons to play with. The customization instead comes from a series of skill trees which are unlocked as you progress through the game. You don't have to make any choices or trade-offs here either. On a long enough timeline, you can unlock everything. Sekiro is far more streamlined and laser-focused on a combat system that's designed to mandate aggression. Instead of rewarding you with health regeneration through something like the rally system in Bloodborne or Lies of P, you're punished for playing passively. You're not merely encouraged to be aggressive, you're required to be aggressive. Before we get into how that works, I want to break down the changes that Sekiro made to the core mechanics of movement, for better and for worse. For starters, you can freely jump around, and you have a grappling hook that allows you to instantly zip to specific grapple points around the world. Both of these abilities are underutilized in the exploration, especially the grappling hook, which has to be one of the least satisfying versions of the idea that I've seen in a game, but they're implemented into the combat pretty well. For instance, the grappling hook can be used to close the gap with enemies or interrupt their attacks. It looks pretty damn cool, but the spectacle hides the fact that you can only latch on to set points in the environment or onto enemies during specific preset attacks, essentially making it a point-and-click ability that doesn't add much freedom, variety, or creativity to either the combat or the exploration. You just see a grappling hook prompt, and you use the grappling hook. Fortunately, the jumping is a lot more satisfying and can be used to bait enemies into attacks, avoid sweeping attacks, or bounce on the heads of your enemies to deal posture damage. When jumping and the grappling hook are combined to gain height over unaware enemies, you can assassinate them with a Dishonored-style drop attack. There is a stealth system here too, but it's so half-assed that I don't even think it's worth talking about. Sound doesn't really factor into it, and there isn't much nuance when it comes to visibility. Enemies can either see you or they can't. The best thing I can say about it is that sometimes you can get a free attack on a mini-boss using stealth, but it's never hard to figure out how to do it, and your stealth skills are never tested. If anything, you're actually punished for using it, since you'll miss out on the experience points and currency that enemies drop. Elden Ring's stealth system has the same problem, but even worse, since stealth attacks aren't a guaranteed one-hit kill like they are in Sekiro. I'm not convinced that stealth fits in with the gameplay of Soulslikes because the genre is so focused on combat and the ways that players engage with enemies. These games are at their best when you're confronting groups of mobs or dueling powerful opponents, while partitioning your resources to survive gauntlet-style levels or 5 to 10 minute long boss fights, especially since their supplemental RPG mechanics are designed to reward you with currency and power for killing things. Thankfully, Lies of P doesn't have a stealth mechanic. Sekiro has less standard attacks than the previous games, despite the fact that it only has a single weapon, having only 2 options: light slashing attacks and a heavy thrust that takes a moment to charge up. While this might sound like a step down, there's a bigger focus on interacting with, not just dodging, incoming attacks than there was in the past. The culprit for this is the entirely new posture system, which is a loose evolution of Dark Souls' poise. Poise works differently for enemies than it did for the player, but our main concern here is how players trigger staggers from enemies. Attacking enemies drains their poise meter, and when it reaches 0, their stance is broken. Usually this allows you to get a critical attack in. Enemies will instantly regenerate their poise if you don't damage them for 10 seconds in Dark Souls 3 and 5 seconds in Dark Souls 1. The poise meter is completely invisible, which means that new players might not even understand why an enemy was staggered by their attacks. Sekiro remedies this by making the posture bar a very visible element on the user interface for both enemies and the player. It's so important, in fact, that it becomes the largest piece of information on the HUD during the boss fights, and for good reason. Filling an enemy's posture bar will open them up to an attack that Sekiro calls a death blow. For smaller enemies this is an instant kill, but bosses and mini-bosses will usually take 2 or 3 death blows before dying. Enemies are very good at blocking your attacks, which means filling the posture bar is going to be the main method of killing most threats. In Lies of P, opening an enemy up to a fatal attack requires you to drain their posture and land a heavy attack on them. You won't clear the rest of their health bar like you would in Sekiro, but you'll deal a good chunk of damage and give yourself a window to use an item or heal. The enemy posture bar regenerates when they aren't being attacked, and the speed at which it refills is based on their current health. If their health is full, the posture will regenerate quickly. Once you get them down to less than half of their maximum health or inflict a status effect like a burn, however, their posture regen will slow to a crawl, making it easier to open them up to a death blow. The posture regeneration punishes you for backing up and giving enemies room to breathe, but heavily rewards those who can stay engaged with their enemies through good gameplay. Skilled players can weave attacks together to apply consistent enough pressure that they can deplete the opponent's posture bar even while they're at full health. Attacking enemies isn't the only method of dealing posture damage to them either, since parrying has been transformed into a new mechanic called deflection. When an enemy attacks you, there's a small window of time where pressing the block button will result in a deflection instead of a block. Deflecting is always better than simply blocking, as your own posture can never be broken while you're successfully deflecting attacks. You're given a lot of audio and visual feedback in combat to let you know how well you're performing. The clangs of swords are satisfying and the animations are buttery smooth. Every successful deflect results in a louder strike and a bright orange flash that sends sparks flying across the screen. The particle effects make it obvious when you've deflected something, but they're still subtle enough that they'll never block your view of your opponent. Controller vibrations put to use here too, providing meaty tactile feedback that reinforces the audio and visuals perfectly. Combat has the spectacle and acrobatics of a high fantasy anime sword fight, but there were clearly more resources put into these visuals than what typically goes into the production of most anime, which are funded by prayers and pocket lint. In between deflections, you can find gaps in your opponent's attacks and strike at them while they're winding up. They'll often respond to you by canceling their own attacks to block and eventually deflect yours. The back and forth nature of the interactions you have during prolonged fights means they feel like conversations rather than an exercise in turn-based call and response. As From Software's games have progressed, enemy combos have become longer and more intricate, but your methods for dealing with them mostly stayed the same. Dodge, roll through or around some attacks, and then retaliate with whatever stamina you have remaining before backing off and doing it again. This is an overly simplistic way of viewing the rhythmic, stamina-driven combat of Demon's Souls, but it's also undeniable that the repetition became clear when the games became more focused on bombastic boss battles that test your reflexes than on puzzle-like encounters that test your problem-solving skills. Sekiro was able to have faster, more interactive combat like this because it doesn't have a stamina system. This allows players to stay engaged with enemies constantly by removing the need for them to be conservative with their attacks, or to disengage so that they can regenerate stamina. In exchange for this, enemies are far more aggressive and give you smaller openings while dealing far more damage. The quickstep returns here and can be spammed infinitely because there's no stamina, and it still provides a small amount of invincibility frames, but you won't find it nearly as useful as it was in Bloodborne because of how potent deflections are. Backing up and giving yourself some room to breathe, use an item, or regenerate your own posture bar is easier than ever before, but it also gives enemies a chance to do the same thing, prolonging the fight and chewing through more of your limited healing supplies. Therefore, even though your potential mobility is higher than ever before, you're going to want to stay close to enemies and keep applying pressure to them instead of running away. You have to learn to deflect attacks consistently or die. Twice.
Suffering is what I desire.
Lies of P builds on the deflection mechanic, referring to it as perfect blocking, but combines it with the traditional Souls-like stamina system, Bloodborne's dodge rolls and quick steps, and the chip damage version of Bloodborne's rally system we discussed earlier. The perfect block timing feels more strict to me than the deflection timings in Sekiro, but it could also be because you can't spam the block button to achieve deflections like you could there. This is something of a newbie crutch, and while you'll struggle to beat the game without learning proper deflection timings, it was a strategy that needed to be addressed. They've done this by making it harder to achieve perfect blocks when you repeatedly press the block button. Once you do get the timing down, you'll quickly notice a new mechanic that Lies of P introduces to reward skilled play. Perfectly blocking enemy attacks deals damage to their weapons, and eventually causes it to break. This will dramatically reduce the amount of damage their attacks deal, giving you a huge incentive to learn the timings necessary to perfectly block damage instead of focusing solely on dodging or blocking. A broken weapon can be the difference between victory and defeat, especially when strong enemies can cleave off half of your health in a single strike. The limited healing makes taking any damage incredibly punishing, but Lies of P manages to make this feel fair by seamlessly blending Sekiro's deflections with Bloodborne's rally mechanic. The resulting combat system is designed around aggressive play without restricting the player's toolset. Each moment-to-moment action has distinct pros, cons, and risks associated with them just like its predecessors, but without sacrificing player freedom for the greater focus on action like Sekiro does. While you're conversing with enemies in Sekiro, you'll have a few options to disrupt the normal rhythm of combat in the form of prosthetic weapons on your left arm. You can add up to 3 of these so-called shinobi tools to your arm at a time and freely swap between them during combat. This system effectively replaces spell casting, and the effects of the shinobi tools vary greatly. For instance, you can use the shurikens to knock enemies out of the air or deal chip damage to them from afar, preventing them from regenerating their posture bar. There's a poison blade that has its own dedicated attack animations that you can mix into your existing katana combos while applying a poison debuff. One of the earliest and most useful tools you can acquire is the flame vent, which can be used to burn foes or scare enemies that are afraid of fire. My favorite tool is the shinobi firecrackers, which can be used to temporarily stun an enemy or disrupt one of their attacks. Each of these tools has a few upgrades that can be unlocked through the upgrade tree, which effectively replaces the simplistic weapon upgrade system of the Dark Souls games. Some of them are only good for countering specific enemy types. The shinobi axe is such a slow weapon that it's only good for dealing with enemies that are holding shields. The axe will shatter their shields instantly, breaking their posture, which looks and feels awesome, but it isn't nearly as practical against bosses, even if it does deal a good amount of damage when the attacks connect. The divine abduction tool, while cool in theory, doesn't really serve much of a purpose. It can spin enemies around and leave them vulnerable to a death blow and instantly kill a few specific enemy types in the Senpo Temple area of the game, but outside of that it doesn't help with much of anything. The finger whistle suffers from a similar fate, only having a substantial effect on enemies like dogs and monkeys. In its upgraded form, it can be used to stun a few specific bosses, but it will only work a few times in the fight before the enemy gets wise and stops listening to the whistle. Another problem I have with the prosthetic tools in Sekiro is the universal ammo, called Spirit Emblems, which is similar to the bullet-based ammunition in Bloodborne. Every prosthetic tool and many weapon arts consume at least a few of these, and you can only carry 15 at the start of the game, and can't restore your supply of Spirit Emblems while you're in combat. It's a very restrictive system, and to make things worse, you have to purchase Spirit Emblems constantly or risk running out of them. They don't regenerate when you rest at a checkpoint, which makes experimentation a costly endeavor. If you run out, you're going to have to grind for more, which is a major pace breaker. You could run out of bullets in Bloodborne as well, but they were mainly used for parrying with your firearms, and you had 20 of them to work with, and most guns only consumed 1 bullet at a time. Sekiro not only starts you with less maximum ammo, but half of the prosthetic tools cost more than 1 Spirit Emblem to use. Normally I love it when a game adds strict resource management to its combat system, but I struggle to enjoy the prosthetic tools because of these limitations. Lies of P has its own version of these in the form of Legion arms, which are also a type of prosthetic that replaces your left arm, albeit with a more sleek sci-fi style than the rudimentary-looking prosthetic arm of Sekiro. There are a few different Legion arms, and each of them has a single ability that can be upgraded through a linear upgrade tree. My favorite of these ended up being the first one that you're given, the Puppet String, which allows you to pull enemies towards you or pull yourself towards enemies and do a massive aerial slam attack when it's fully upgraded. There's also an explosive shield that blows up when struck by an attack, a hand that can charge up a big lightning pulse to stun enemies, a gun arm, which is totally badass, and one that allows you to lay down landmines. The Legion arms that deal elemental damage are all strong against enemies that are weak to those respective damage types, such as fire being strong against fleshy enemies, but fire damage is still going to be useful against practically everything because of the overheat debuff it applies, which is this game's version of a burn status effect. Legion arms draw from their own dedicated pool of ammo instead of drawing from a universal ammo pool like the prosthetic tools in Sekiro, which can be restored by consumable items or set to recharge from attacking enemies by a perk in the upgrade tree. I'm not sure if I'd consider the Legion arms an improvement over Sekiro's prosthetics or more of a lateral move, but I like the Legion arms more since they have their own resource bar that regenerates when you rest. This made me feel a lot more comfortable with using them liberally. Despite this, the system is still limited like the one in Sekiro, just in a different way, because you can only equip 1 Legion arm at a time. Each effect is more broadly useful, and none of them feel like they're specifically designed to counter a certain enemy or enemy type, but Sekiro gives players room to experiment with the prosthetic tools by letting them have up to 3 of them equipped at the same time. Maybe this would result in a little bit too much versatility for our one-armed Pinocchio, but it would very much be in line with the goal of maximizing player freedom. You can equip 2 Legion arms and switch between them in New Game Plus, but that should have been available from the start, or unlocked halfway through the game instead of being a replay exclusive feature. Both Sekiro and Lies of P have one final trick up their sleeves, and it's the one thing that I think Sekiro does unquestionably better. While fighting, sometimes a red warning will appear on the screen that indicates that an enemy is about to use a perilous attack that can't be blocked. There are 3 types of perilous attacks that you'll see throughout the game. Grabs, which are self-explanatory and extremely punishing. Thrust attacks, which can be deflected or stomped on by the Makiri counter, the first skill you unlock in Sekiro's skill tree, and sweeps, which can be jumped over and used as an opportunity to stomp on an enemy's head, Mario style. These attacks can all be dealt with directly or dodged, although grab attacks demand that you disengage the opponent and focus on avoiding the grab's hitboxes. These perilous attacks disrupt the normal flow of combat and require you to read your opponent's body language to determine the correct response to their upcoming strike, meaning that you can never completely zone out and get lost in the rhythm of clashing metal and particle effects. You have to stay lucid and alert or risk getting struck by a devastating attack that can single-handedly ruin your attempt at a boss fight. Lies of P has its own version of this system, called Fury attacks, but they're typically just large swings that can't be blocked normally. You'll need to avoid the attack or deflect it. This game totally lacks the animation reading and mixed reactions that are required by Sekiro. You just need to work out the timing or move out of the way. There isn't nearly as much pattern recognition required. These attacks are often punctuation marks that top off an enemy's combo, much like in Sekiro, but they aren't quite as interesting and they never open up an enemy for a massive hit to their stagger bar in the same way that the Makiri counter and Goomba Stomp do. It feels undercooked in comparison, and I'm not sure why they chose to design their version of the perilous attacks like this. It's almost like they made all of their combos first and then decided that each boss should have a few attacks that are arbitrarily harder to block after the fact and came up with this system. That's probably not what happened, of course, but I think that even one additional call and response pattern would have gone a long way. What if we had access to something similar to the Makiri counter? What if attacks from the Legion arm could disrupt Fury attacks? Maybe the simplicity that Lies of P went for was the right approach, especially considering the amount of mechanical complexity that it already has, but I'm still left wondering what they can do with this foundation in their next game. The combat here is an impressive blend of ideas and mechanics from the games that so clearly inspired Lies of P. It's a promising showcase of just how much more intense and interactive we can make the combat in this genre without discarding the player freedom and RPG elements that it was founded on like Sekiro does. Like all the best RPGs, Lies of P does a great job forcing you to specialize when building your character. The build variety is well beyond what was present in Bloodborne, Dark Souls, and Sekiro because it combines its RPG stat system with a highly modular skill tree that forces you to diversify your build. You have to select at least 2 types of minor upgrades per node, sometimes more, in order to build up to the big ticket upgrades. This prevents you from neglecting defensive and utility upgrades to focus on offensive ones, and vice versa. There's no shortage of useful perks to unlock, and it's very easy to re-roll and reset your entire character to fine-tune your build or try something completely different, which is something that I really loved about Elden Ring too. I've seen a bit of negative discussion about the Rising Dodge upgrade, which helps you recover from being knocked off your feet more quickly, being locked behind the skill tree, but I don't mind it. Getting knocked over in the middle of a fight should be a severe punishment for making a mistake, not a trivial punishment like the small stumbles and staggers that occur when you get hit by a standard attack. I'm sure that some of this frustration comes from the fact that you won't be able to use every upgrade that you might want to try in a single playthrough, but that opens the door for experimentation and acts as an incentive to replay the game. The game's innovative weapon crafting system works in tandem with this huge amount of build variety to make an already vast combat sandbox even more interesting for players to explore. When it comes to weapons, both Bloodborne and Lies of P discarded most of the traditional Dungeons & Dragons fantasy weaponry. Bloodborne introduces a variety of so-called trick weapons, almost all of which have an alternative form that involves them changing shape, breaking apart into multiple pieces, or combining to form a greater whole. There's a straight sword that turns into a warhammer, a curved sword that turns into a bow, a blunt metal rod that channels electricity, a dagger that splits apart into 2 daggers, and a mace that connects to a giant rotating saw. Even the simpler designs like the saw cleaver and the saw spear still manage to have quite a lot of variety in their attack animations, effective ranges, and damage types. Most weapons have at least one form with large, sweeping attacks that are useful for crowd control or for breaking the limbs of large enemies. This is a natural evolution of a minor mechanic from Dark Souls, where sharp weapons could cut the tail off of some creatures, removing an attack or two from their moveset. Breaking limbs is a new way to stagger enemies and open them up for critical hits, and it's very much in line with the visceral nature of Bloodborne's world. The trick weapons replace the one-handed, two-handed system from the previous games, with some weapons even being one-handed in both forms. This is an important thing to note because it means that your left hand is open for a gun, which is this game's replacement for shields. While Bloodborne does have shields, one of them is basically a joke weapon and the other is found deep into the DLC areas and is only designed to block elemental damage and magic. Contrary to popular opinion, this wasn't done because players were trained to be cowardly by shields in the previous games, but because Bloodborne's mechanical storytelling revolves around movement and aggression rather than careful exploration and methodical room clearing. Try hiding behind your shield forever in Dark Souls, it won't get you very far. Firearms are your main method of parrying enemies here, and they don't deal much damage without a specific build and can't block attacks at all. More enemy attacks are parryable in Bloodborne than in Dark Souls or Demon Souls because enemies don't necessarily need to swing at you with an attack that can be deflected with a shield. The trade-off to this is that now parry staggers are a limited resource that are gated behind ammunition in addition to good timing. I already mentioned that you can carry up to 20 bullets for most of the game. You'll need to time your shots well or you might be out of ammo when you need it most. There are some weapons, like the cannon and the flamethrower, that aren't designed to stagger enemies like this, but each of those weapons has its own dedicated purpose or elemental damage that make it useful in some other way. The loss of traditional RPG weaponry was the first major departure from the formula that Demon Souls established, and it's something that Lies of P would go on to happily embrace. The weapons in Lies of P don't typically have multiple stances or transformations like the ones in Demon Souls or Bloodborne, although there are a handful of them that do, and they're wielded with one hand so that your character's left arm is available for a Legion arm attack. Lies of P's developers clearly wanted to expand on the diverse movesets of the weapons in Bloodborne by putting you in the role of a weaponsmith who creates those weapons themselves. Each weapon has two parts, a handle and a quote-unquote blade, which is just whatever part you're whacking enemies with. When you're upgrading a weapon, you're actually upgrading its blade, which acts as a vessel for most of its stats. The handle determines the moveset of the blade it's attached to and the damage type that it will do. A rapier handle will deal piercing damage, but this isn't going to be a good fit for a blade that was expressly designed for slash attacks. Lies of P doesn't stop you from creating a weapon like this anyways, which is part of the charm of the system. The player isn't barred from experimenting even if the result of their mad science kinda sucks. On the flip side, you might combine a handle with fast slashing animations with a massive cleaver blade and get a weapon that deals huge amounts of damage with low commitment attacks. In my head, I was imagining that this was the sort of thing that the Hunter Workshop from Bloodborne would have been doing to create the badass trick weapons that we get to use in that game. The freedom doesn't end there, even though it could have. Each blade and handle has some kind of built-in stat scaling to make it better or worse with different builds. The stat scaling is ripped directly from Software's games down to the way that it's shown through letter grades. The difference here is that if a handle has a moveset that you like, but stat scaling that doesn't match your build, you can find an upgrade material called a crank that allows you to change its stat scaling to better suit your needs. You can also use these cranks to further increase the strength of a weapon that already fits your build. There are plenty of these to find around the world, and these cranks ensure that basically every weapon combination can be viable with enough resource investment. The level of build variety and player freedom on display here is impressive not just for a Soulslike, but an RPG in general. You're given the tools to make your loadout unique, and there are enough appealing options here that I could see myself giving most of them a try someday when I replay this game again. It's worth noting that you can receive special weapons using items you get from bosses, and that these weapons cannot be broken down and used in weapon crafting. It's a bit of a bummer, but they have special movesets and weapon skills tied to them, so it evens out. From Software's games have their own form of weapon customization, of course, although none of them go as far as Lies of P does. In Demon Souls, the Dark Souls series, and Elden Ring, you can ascend weapons using special upgrade materials that allow you to change their scaling or provide additional effects to the weapon, such as elemental damage or poison. Weapons will gain a new prefix when you do this. For instance, your longsword may become a quality longsword. Quality weapons have lower base stats, but higher scaling for both strength and dexterity, which makes them more powerful later into the game if you've been investing points into both of those stats throughout your playthrough. There's another prefix called Raw that has the opposite effect. It increases the base damage of the weapon and completely removes its stat scaling, making it a powerful choice for the early game. Bloodborne sees players using blood gems to upgrade their weapons, and these deviate a lot from the other Souls-like upgrade systems. Throughout the world, you'll find gemstones of a few different shapes that can be embedded into your weapons. Each weapon has 3 slots that are slowly unlocked as you upgrade it, and each type of slot focuses vaguely on a specific kind of effect. Like the other games, each of these gems have effects ranging from straight damage increases to increasing your weapon's rally potential or applying elemental damage. There are also cursed blood gems that have downsides to go along with their buffs, such as faster weapon degradation or constantly draining health for the player. Each blood gem has a randomly generated effect and a randomly generated number associated with that effect. I'm not a huge fan of these, not just because they require some grinding to acquire, but because they don't change the way the weapon feels to use. Blood gems are just another way to add more stats to your weapons, which is pretty boring overall. In fact, none of From Software's approaches to weapon progression go out of their way to make your tools feel wholly unique in the same way that the weapon crafting system from Lies of P does. They do the bare minimum to create a feeling of growth for the player and to encourage exploration, but the weapon crafting in Lies of P accomplishes the same goal while also making every weapon you find both a new tool and a new set of parts to experiment with. Even if you aren't interested in using a weapon as you find it, you might want to try out the new moveset attached to the handle, which is a substantial reward in and of itself. The game still rewards you with ore to increase the raw stats of your arsenal, but these clearly aren't the stars of the show. The crafting system also expands on one of the best ideas presented in Dark Souls 3. This title is, once again, more focused on refinement than it is on originality. While the rally system and guns have been discarded for the sake of returning to the traditional fantasy setting, we have a new idea in their place called weapon arts. When you're using a shield that has parry as its weapon art, it still acts as the parry button, but every other weapon's been given some additional utility in the form of a buff, a special attack, or an alternative set of attacks with unique animations. Weapon arts cost mana to use, which limits the amount of times you can use them in a fight and gives mana use for characters that don't use spells. The goal behind this is clear. They want to make sure that weapons felt more unique than they did in the previous games. 2 longswords might have the same basic moveset, but they can be made into 2 distinct tools if one of them has a powerful attack as its weapon art and the other has a buff or defensive ability. Bloodborne made its weapons feel unique by implementing multiple forms and movesets for most of them, but had fewer options in the games that preceded it as a result. Quality over quantity. Dark Souls 3 is striving for a quantity over quality approach instead, but it's nice that they managed to come up with something that gives every weapon that extra bit of spice that they need to feel unique. Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice advances the weapon arts by allowing you to freely equip one of them at a time. Because there aren't multiple weapons in the game, this was probably the best way to handle it. You can activate whatever skill you have equipped by tapping both the block and attack buttons at the same time. Some of these attacks can be used for free, and some of them cost spirit emblems to use, which ties into the universal ammo system that we discussed earlier. You can pause at any time during combat to swap out the weapon art you're using, which is a disruption to the flow of combat, but still allows for a lot more freedom than Dark Souls 3 did. The weapon arts here are also quite a bit more varied than they were in Dark Souls 3, ranging from simple spitting attacks and gap closers to hand-to-hand martial arts or acrobatic combos ripped straight out of a shonen anime. They aren't all useful, and some of them might even have straight upgrades that you unlock further down their respective skill trees, but the level of customization here is admirable. Elden Ring would further expand on this by allowing you to change the special skill attached to standard weapons. These skills are scattered around the world independently and act as a new reward for exploration that add a new layer of customization to builds. Some of these skills were carried over from Dark Souls 3, but many of them are brand new. Lies of P's weapon art equivalent isn't quite as flexible as the Ashes of War from Elden Ring, but its own system is perfectly designed around the weapon crafting system. Each blade and handle has a skill that's associated with it, and they're set in stone, but this also means that each assembled weapon will have access to 2 skills at a time. This is another factor to consider when crafting your weapons, and means that each blade is more than a bundle of stats. Handles tend to have more defensive skills, while blades offer offensive buffs or special attacks that consume most, if not all, of your mana bar to deal a massive amount of damage or stagger enemies. The powerful moves and combos attached to weapons often provide the player with hyper armor, which creates a strong incentive to use them. Mixing and matching these different skills can allow you to perform devastating attacks with buffs applied to them, or to give yourself a suite of defensive options for more survivability. Lies of P also proposes a new iteration of the weapon durability systems found throughout the genre. From Software dropped weapon durability with Elden Ring since it would have gotten in the way of the game's exploration, but its predecessors didn't exactly have the best implementations of the concept to begin with. In Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1, weapon durability is essentially a tax that you're paying to use your weapons. You have to get a blacksmith to repair them, but this probably exists more for the sake of immersion than anything else, since a prepared player will rarely experience a moment where their weapon breaks. Durability is fairly easy to ignore as long as you're repairing your weapons whenever you visit a blacksmith to upgrade them. If your weapon does break, it might create a memorable moment. Imagine, you're neck deep in the unknown or fighting a tough boss when your favorite sword shatters.
Oh no!
Dark Souls 2 tried to make this a more common scenario, but the end result was a game where the weapons felt like they're made out of whatever flimsy metals the Hylians used to make all the weapons in the open world Zelda games. The saving grace is that your weapon durability was automatically restored when you rested at a checkpoint unless it was completely shattered, but this also means that players that used multiple weapons rarely had to think about the system anyways. It was the same problem as before, but with an even worse implementation. Dark Souls 3 has the same durability system, but the weapons have too much durability instead of too little. This is even worse than Dark Souls 2 because now the entire system is completely ignorable. In fact, when double checking this, I saw that the durability article on Fextralife's Dark Souls 3 wiki provides a list of tips for breaking your equipment, since it's so hard to do during normal gameplay. I've never had a weapon break during my 2 playthroughs of Dark Souls 3, so that checks out for me. Liza P finally gets this right by making weapons flimsy but easy to repair in the middle of a level. You have access to a grindstone from the start of the game that can be used to repair your weapons at any time, so the main challenge posed by weapon durability is having to manage it during combat. This might sound annoying, but I think it's really interesting. Your weapons degrade when you deal damage or block attacks, and their degradation speed is exacerbated by a few of the status effects in the game, sometimes forcing you into using openings during a fight to repair your weapon instead of attacking. There were a few moments where my sword broke in the heat of the moment, causing me to panic and desperately reach for my grindstone or die trying. You can't neglect your weapons, you need to keep an eye on them while you're fighting. This is already a substantial improvement over the system from Dark Souls 2 and 3, but what pushes it over the top for me is that repairing your weapons doesn't cost you anything. The designers have figured out a way to make this mechanic feel impactful by making it another resource to manage during combat instead of attacks. This puts weapon durability more in line with the rest of the resource management you'll be doing, which revolves around the mana and healing systems. Let's rewind again. In Demon Souls, there was a mana bar that determined how many spells you could cast at a time. Mana can be restored by consuming spices found throughout the world and stocked in shops. You can easily spam spells in Demon Souls, which makes magic extremely powerful. With a small investment of souls, you can have practically infinite mana as long as you take a few seconds to chat on spices every now and then. Health, which acts as an in-game representation of how many mistakes players can make before reaching a fail state, suffered from the same problem, since the game's healing grasses were equally abundant. Taking damage wasn't an issue unless you forgot to heal or took a lot of damage in a small window of time, which puts more emphasis on the moment-to-moment enemy encounters than on partitioning limited resources to survive a gauntlet. The end result is that players who took time to grind for items or spent some souls on spice and healing grass could deflate a lot of the tension that the game's long levels and hard-hitting enemies were designed to establish. It also destroyed the balance of the PvP since players could come into invasions with too many healing items, needlessly prolonging fights. Dark Souls 1 transitioned away from this model and instead applied a hard limit to how many times you could heal or use each individual spell between checkpoints. There is no mana bar here, which means you have to be a lot more thoughtful about your spell usage outside of a few spells that have enough charges to be spammed, like Soul Arrow. There are a few ways to expand the number of uses your spells have, but not by enough to be as game-breaking as the spices from Demon Souls. Rooting the healing system in a set number of charges with the Estus Flask is a clever way of ensuring players can't grind themselves out of tension. Your healing is essentially static, and this means that the level designers will have a pretty good idea of how much health players actually have in between each checkpoint. It also helps balance out PvP, since each player involved will have a predictable amount of healing. Players can consume Humanity, which is the equivalent of Stones of Ephemeral Eyes from Demon Souls, to empower specific bonfires, which supplies your Estus Flask with more healing charges when you rest there. This opens you up to invasions by forcing you into human form, but will make the area around that bonfire quite a bit more forgiving by at least doubling the amount of healing you have access to. This is a great system for adaptive difficulty, and I know that I appreciated it on my first playthrough of the game. It's easy to understand and lets you try exploring new areas without an empowered bonfire first, letting you decide for yourself if you need more healing or not before devoting resources to it. I'm not sure if I'd say it's the best healing system that a Soulslike's ever had, but it serves Dark Souls 1's level design perfectly and adds a dimension of tense, resource-driven exploration that not even Demon Souls had to offer. It reminds me of the limited healing that you might find in a survival horror game, and it sometimes evokes the same feelings of apprehension and desperation that those kind of games are designed to deliver. Before we continue, it's worth noting that Demon Souls, the Dark Souls trilogy, and Elden Ring all have spells that players can use to heal themselves in addition to their standardized healing items. These are supplementary and only available to players who opt into using Holy Miracles. Dark Souls 2 reintroduced consumable healing items in the form of life gems, meaning it doesn't really try to solve the problem that was present in Demon Souls at all, and actively discards a perfectly good solution for it. They did maintain the spell charge system from Dark Souls 1 though, and the Estus Flask is still present too, meaning there are quite a few sources of healing available. They did use this to create longer levels, but they sort of shot themselves in the foot by adding way more checkpoints around the world than was necessary. Regardless, Dark Souls 2 introduces the concept of Estus shards that can be used to increase the number of charges for the flask permanently as you progress through the game. These shards are actually a pretty good idea that are ruined by the inclusion of life gems. Fortunately, future games would keep running with this and even improve on it. Bloodborne doesn't have spells in the traditional sense, but it does have hunter tools that consume bullets as their ammunition. You can create more bullets for yourself by sacrificing some of your health, which puts a greater emphasis on healing for playstyles that revolve around casting spells with the hunter tools or using guns for damage. We've already discussed the rally system, which is the core healing mechanic of Bloodborne, but this game does bring back consumable healing items like the ones in Demon Souls in the form of blood vials. It tries and fails to solve the problem of healing grass being too abundant by limiting the maximum amount of blood vials you can carry to 20. That's still way too many, since each vial will restore 40% of your maximum health by default. Enemies drop blood vials constantly, which continuously restocks your supply of them. And while this does allow levels to be long like they were in Demon Souls, it also means you have way too much healing for boss fights when you take the rally system into account. To compound this, Bloodborne has many levels where you open shortcuts that take you directly from the checkpoint to the boss, which practically guarantees that you'll have 20 blood vials for every fight. You're drowning in healing here, which maybe makes sense from a narrative perspective since hunters are coated in blood constantly, but it doesn't work in the gameplay's favor. Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring bring back the mana bar from Demon Souls, but they don't bring back the spices. Instead, mana restoration comes from blue flasks with a limited number of charges between checkpoints, just like the health restoring ones. These mana restoration flasks coexist alongside the established healing flasks, and you have to split a collective number of charges between both types. The number of maximum charges you have to work with can be increased by finding Estus shards or golden seeds around the world. This is another good implementation of the healing flask concept introduced in Dark Souls 1, and there aren't any pointless consumable items muddying things up like there were in Dark Souls 2. Developers can still plan around a predictable amount of healing for each level of the game this way, while still facilitating some sense of progression for the player and while rewarding exploration. There is one big downside to this model. They had to make sure players who were splitting their flash charges between both healing and mana still have access to enough healing to actually stay alive, so there ends up being way too much healing for players who never use mana at all. As Joseph Anderson put it in his critique of Dark Souls 3,
and I think that 15 is just simply too many for experienced players. This is like having a kindled bonfire that follows you around like you owe it money, and for me this was a big problem because while I agree that having more charges is necessary for the larger levels, there's too many of them when the game switches from exploration to boss time. With the exception of Nameless King, there wasn't a single boss in this game that I had to sit down and really put effort into learning attack patterns and how to react to things, because I had so much Estus that I could get to the fog door with so much healing that it didn't matter. I could make mistakes and play really greedy. A risky hit is worth it because I can heal, the boss can't.
I believe this problem applies to both Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring. They did try to offset this by making weapon arts consume mana, which is an incentive for everyone to reserve at least 1 or 2 healing flasks for mana restoration, but it isn't necessary to do so. The entire mechanic is designed to give mages the freedom to decide their own casting limits, and the option to load yourself up on healing flasks is a byproduct of that. Few Soulslikes have adopted the healing system from Dark Souls 1 for some reason, perhaps because the genre has shifted towards intricate, action-filled boss fights instead of exploration. While Dark Souls 1's system works well for boss fights, it really shines when you're exploring a new area without any idea of where the next checkpoint is. If we're thinking about healing from the perspective of a dedicated action game instead, then the flasks from Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring are perfectly acceptable and might even do the job better. Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice also adopts this healing system, although it only has a healing gourd because it doesn't have a mana bar. Lies of P looks for ways to tie its mana and healing systems back to dealing damage whenever possible. Instead of a healing flask, we have pulse cells which heal you on use. You start with 3 of these, which is a pretty low number, but it isn't long before you start getting mandatory healing upgrades during the main story, and are given ways to purchase more healing through the game's skill tree system. This is most comparable to the healing system from Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring, and Sekiro, but it does have a new supplementary mechanic to make it more interesting. When you run out of healing charges, you enter a discharged state where you generate new energy for your pulse cell by dealing damage to enemies. When you manage to charge it up, you get access to another heal. This rewards you for engaging in combat successfully when you're low on health, and gives you a way to make a comeback during the harder fights in the game. There are even some buffs for the discharged state in the skill tree to make it more powerful, giving you an edge when you're low on resources. Players can clutch additional heals to keep themselves going, but you're punished for sloppy gameplay because it also gets harder and harder to charge the pulse cell every time it gets discharged between checkpoints. This is a fantastic way to add tension to both boss fights and exploration while rewarding skilled play. It's the best of all worlds. The mana system in Lies of P, called Fable, is equally elegant in its implementation. Fable is divided into sections that are consumed when you use a weapon skill, and you can refill this meter through the use of a consumable item, which you can carry a limited number of between checkpoints, and by landing successful attacks on enemies. Just like the pulse cell discharge mechanic, this rewards players for aggression and ensures that they'll have a steady supply of mana to use their special attacks even if they don't have items to recover it. When you die, you drop your Fable in addition to your Ergo, which is the game's currency, and can retrieve it by returning to the point where you died. Lies of P drops Ergo in front of gates to boss fights, which ensures that you can always start bosses with some of your Fable meter while also removing all of the risks that come with entering a boss fight to begin with. This is atypical. Other Souls-likes will leave your resources somewhere inside the boss arena if you die there. I'm not sure that this quality of life feature was necessary, but I think a lot of people are going to prefer it to the way it works in the Soulsborne games. Fable's only used for weapon skills, and they actually tend to consume most, if not all, of your base Fable meter. You start with 3 sections and can unlock more later through the skill tree. All 3 starting weapons have a combo skill that eats through 3 sections in exchange for tons of damage, and a handle skill that consumes 1 section in exchange for a defensive maneuver or buff. You'll need to use multiple consumable items to restore all of your Fable bar, so there's a pretty strict action economy surrounding these special moves that forces you to be careful with them. I won't act like being able to spam the weapon arts in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring is actually a bad thing, although it can be a little game-breaking, but Lies of P manages to make these skills feel impactful through their relative scarcity, even though they're less powerful and less visually impressive than the comparable moves in Elden Ring. Lies of P is dedicated to keeping the player engaged with enemies as often as possible, and these mechanics are here to enforce that behavior alongside the intricacies of the core combat system. Lies of P also builds on the Physic Flask system from Elden Ring with its Wishstone Cube. Both the Physic Flask and Wishstone Cube can be loaded up with materials found throughout the world to provide the player with buffs of their choice that can be used whenever they feel that they're appropriate, usually during boss fights. Elden Ring's Physics Flask can be loaded up with 2 tiers that regenerate every time you rest at a checkpoint, with each tier having its own effect. Lies of P's Wishstone Cube can only contain a single buff by default, and the stone that produces it is consumed on use. These effects can be anything from increased stamina to health regeneration or damage buffs. In order to acquire more, you'll need to harvest gold coin fruit from a tree in the hub area. These fruits can be traded for wish stones or used to respec your build. This is all well and good, but the fruits grow on a timer, and the tree can only hold a limited amount of fruit, forcing you to make a quick visit to it on a regular basis. I don't see the point in this personally, especially since you can acquire plenty of gold coin fruit throughout the game as it is. If you do happen to run out, there isn't much you can do but wait for more to grow. You can speed up this process by injecting the tree with growth hormones, but you'll still have to wait. I think it would have been better for wish stones to regenerate when you died or rested like the Physics Flask from Elden Ring, and to lock in new types of wish stones behind gold coin fruits instead. This would preserve the narrative significance of the tree without making the player feel like their wish stones are a restricted resource. The tree is a reference to the adventures of Pinocchio, the original book that the game is based on, and it's connected to a few side quests, which is something else that Lies of P genuinely excels at.
We knew you were a true friend, and generous.
Not the narratives of the quests themselves, although those are quite good, but the way that the progression through the side quests is communicated to the player. Back when Elden Ring came out, there was a bit of controversy over the total absence of a bookkeeping feature for the game. NPCs have long, intricate quest lines with desirable narrative and material rewards, but following these NPCs from place to place in such a large world revealed a problem that the quests in these games have always had: bad conveyance. How are players supposed to see your awesome side quests without resorting to a guide or wiki if you don't actually signpost them and help people find them? How are players supposed to know that this important NPC is moved to some seemingly random, obscure hut halfway across the world since you last spoke to them without a quest log? While I have a bone to pick with this lack of communication to the player, I think it's intentional. I'm not the biggest fan of this storytelling myself, but the focus of the Souls games is combat, as we've already discussed, and this approach allows that to take center stage. That being said, I'm still left wondering what it would feel like for one of these games to have a more straightforward and easy to follow narrative. I think Lies of P has the answer, and it doesn't come in the form of quest markers or a quest log. Whenever you view the fast travel screen, you'll be informed about any pending conversations around the world by an icon of the character that wants to talk to you next to the location where you can find them. It's so simple. It was so simple this entire time, and it's a good thing that Lies of P does this, because I thought the storyline was touching and earnest. All the side quests reach their climax at around the same time, making the final stretch of the game feel appropriately dense, eventful, and climactic. It embraces its ridiculous premise in a way that reminds me of the Kingdom Hearts games, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't get a few reactions out of me. Instead of blatantly ripping off Berserk like From Software, it's blatantly ripping off children's fairy tales. There are characters, events, and locations that are taken directly from the book, and they always find a way to make them fit into the moody, post-apocalyptic world of Krat. I love that they turned all the fable animals that Pinocchio meets into furries wearing animal masks to hide their identities.
It's quite odd that we should meet in a place like this.
My favorite of these characters are the Black Rabbit Brotherhood, a recurring group of territorial thugs that you fight a couple of times. They have strong chemistry and act as one of the better examples of a gang fight that we've seen in the genre. This video is focused on the combat, so I don't want to dig too deep into the story here, but before we end it, there's one piece of storytelling that I wanted to call attention to. In a presentation called The Lack Thereof, Risk of Rain composer In a presentation called The Lack Thereof, the composer for the Risk of Rain series discusses the amount of work that goes into making music for a video game and how underappreciated musicians who work in this industry often are.
The idea of the composer who has assistants and teams and who works for AAA games and has a huge studio and can hire feature players and orchestras. This is a small subgroup in the composer community. I can safely say that most of us pretty much work alone throughout every stage of the work, like composing, recording, performing, mixing, mastering, some of us even implementing, and then of course all the work that takes to get an album out to you. And unfortunately, most of us remain unknown and unnamed, despite the hard work and despite the quality of the work. The reality is, every composer whose name you know is essentially an exception. For every composer you know, there are like 10, 20, 50 other composers struggling to get their music out there, acknowledged and heard by people, both developers and an audience, and pretty much struggle to make ends meet.
He goes on to pull up tons of examples of gaming publications completely ignoring the music in their coverage of a game.
Okay, we got one result. She'll pick through records at a music store. That's the mention of music in The Last of Us. Are you f***ing kidding me? The vast majority of gaming publications, especially major ones, seldom spare more than a couple of sentences of the review real estate on music and sound. Even these laconic inclusions typically stay away from any meaningful criticism, and usually you just get how awesome the music is or that the game has bangers, which really don't offer any practical insights to the potential reader about how music is deployed in the game and how it works and how it amplifies the experience.
Music is often relegated to being a background element, and composers, despite their importance to the artistic direction and vibes of a game, typically stay in the background of the discourse as well. This is probably because music is hard to discuss in an objective fashion. Not only are individual tastes going to vary wildly from person to person, but describing the specific music techniques, chord progressions, or scales that are being used by a piece of music doesn't always tell us much about why it's good. It might tell us the genre that the music falls into, but that's something that we can get an intuitive understanding of just by listening to it. I'm a musician, but even I find it pretty challenging to talk about music in a meaningful way in those terms, so instead I'm going to talk about one way that Lies of P uses its music to reinforce its themes and progress its narrative. Most of the time you're only going to be hearing the sounds of the environment you're exploring, though there are a few levels that use diegetic music to enhance the mood. Boss fights are usually scored by bombastic orchestral pieces. As you explore and complete side quests, you'll collect records that you can play on a record player in the hub area while you're upgrading your gear, leveling up, and chatting with the other characters.
She'll pick through records at the music store.
These songs were created specifically to be given out as quest rewards. Each record has a period-appropriate Art Nouveau-styled illustration on their label, and they do a lot to reinforce the somber atmosphere of Hotel Krat. This is already well above the bar of how music is used in literally all of From Software's games, but Lies of P goes even further beyond by tying these records into the classic fairy tale story of Pinocchio learning to become a real boy. Our main character becomes more human by experiencing the emotional climax of different side quests and by listening to music. It's a stupid and obvious thing to say, but I can't think of anything more human than music, so this made me really happy. The music has roots in NeoWiz Games' own DJ Max series of rhythm games. They recomposed the music from that franchise to fit the setting of Lies of P. This is where we can insert a funny joke about Sekiro and Lies of P being rhythm games, by the way. I can't imagine that it was easy to convert club dance tracks to melancholic vocal jazz and chamber pop, but the results are undeniably compelling and enjoyable. Good job to everyone who worked on the sound team for this project.
Music, good or bad, shapes gaming experiences.
If it isn't abundantly clear by this point, I love this game. I wasn't expecting it to impress me nearly as much as it did, but I'm happy to be swept off my feet every now and then. I'm also happy to see that the game has reached 1 million sales, and I hope that it continues to get even more positive attention and word of mouth in the future. It's something truly special and proves that sometimes originality is overrated.